Welcome, everybody. Today is Tuesday, March 25th, and on Tuesdays we have Mr. Dwoskin presenting his In the Headlines lecture series. Mr. Dwoskin, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Angela. Hi, everybody. Thank you for tuning in. It's amazing how fast time flies because we're now at the end of March, and we actually passed the first day of spring this past week. So, the first day of spring means that the amount of daylight and darkness is the same. So we're now on the more daylight side, and it just means that before you know it, we'll be into nice, mild weather where we can all appreciate the things we love to appreciate outdoors. There's been so much happening this past week. It's very hard to know where to start, but I guess the calling of the Canadian election is really, for us, probably the most important event of the week. And we had designed a system that we thought would be a fair way to time elections, which is to hold them on fixed dates, just the way they do it in the U.S. Every 4 years on the same day or same week. And it just doesn't seem to work out that way. The fact that we have a minority government in Canada means that at any moment a government could fall. And once a government falls, the Governor General can then decide that an election would be held. Or the Governor General can ask the opposition party to try to form a government. And if that doesn't work, then an election is held. And this time the government didn't fall, but the Prime Minister decided on his own to call an election because in all likelihood, the government would have fallen next week because of the new leadership and the opposition of the NDP to keep on supporting the government. So an election was called, and if anybody had a look at the polls that were published by different polling companies this past week, I would have to say that I have never seen such a huge change in polling in such a short time. Certainly compared to the US election, where the polls pretty well held steady, up or down a couple of percentage points. But when Justin Trudeau was Prime Minister, the Liberal Party was down 25% plus or minus in the polls, meaning that there was talk that the Bloc Québécois might have even become the official opposition. And by his resignation and by Mr. Carney taking over, the polls jumped up so high that, I'm sure you've all heard, that the two parties are pretty well tied in the popular vote, somewhere around 37% each. And given the way the votes of the Conservatives are concentrated in the West, the 37% for the Liberals would mean that they would win the election or get more seats than the Conservatives would with the same amount of votes. In actual fact, the poll that I saw showed that the Liberals had, I think, 37.4%, and the Conservatives had 37%. So even in the raw vote, the Liberals were ahead. Now, is the leadership of Mr. Carney the only explanation for this? Clearly, this can't be the case. Most Canadians probably never heard of Mark Carney before this cycle. People may have known that he was the governor of Bank of Canada. People may have known that he was the governor of the Bank of England. But, unless you were really kind of into international economics, these positions would not mean very much to the average citizen. And so Mark Carney was kind of a respected Canadian, and that's all people knew about him. So there must be something else at play in this huge jump of the Liberals and the huge fall of the Conservatives. And that thing, of course, is Donald Trump. Donald Trump has repeated his threats to take over Canada. He's repeated his threats to impose high tariffs on Canada. He's repeated his threats to take over Greenland. He's repeated his threats to abandon the NATO alliance, which Canada is part of. And so these threats, and he's also challenged, Trump has also challenged the border between Canada and the United States, saying it's artificial. So, we never know with him whether he's just boasting or whether he actually means it, or whether meaning it, he intends to do something about it. And with Trump, you just never know on all these three possibilities. But the fact that these threats have come from him means that Canadians have shifted their perception on what's important in this election and what's important to them. And what's important to them is to maintain Canadian independence, to support the Canadian economy, under threat from the American tariffs, to oppose the United States and to oppose Mr. Trump in particular. And I believe, and I'm sure most of you believe, that this is the reason why the Liberal Party's fortunes have gone up so much, have soared. Because Mr. Poilievre, the head of the Conservative Party, in certain ways was marketing himself as a kind of a mini Trump, not obviously to the same degree as Trump was using, not to do the worst of the things that Trump has been doing, which is just about everything, in terms of boasting, lying, cheating, all of the things that he's been proven to have done. But on the other hand, Mr. Carney has taken a kind of a populist approach to Canadian politics, a populist approach to Canada, which he sort of copied from Mr. Trump. And he downplayed at first the threat of the United States to Canada, and instead was harping on the failures of the Liberal government, excessive taxation, excessive regulation, the carbon tax, and the issues of the cultural issues of what's called wokeness. And in the face of the attacks that the Americans have made, all of these other items seem to be so irrelevant and so unimportant compared to the possibility of Canada losing hundreds of thousands of jobs just in the auto sector if America imposes their 25% duty on Canadian cars. And as well, to repeat, Canada sends 75% of its exports to the US. It's about tied with Mexico as being the most dependent country on one single customer. And obviously that doesn't put us in a good position, because we don't have other customers to sell the goods that we would sell the US, that we sell to the US. So, in light of these really serious and remaining serious threats to Canada, an election campaign that's held on any other positions or any other factors, it seems to be a little irrelevant at this point. So that explains the huge sort of shift in popularity between the Liberals and the Conservatives. But what about the other parties? What about the NDP and the Bloc Québécois? The other two parties who have seats in the House of Commons, besides the Green Party, which has 2 seats, their support has also dropped. And in a certain sense, this is a bit surprising and yet not surprising. One of the little bits of ironies is that both Mr. Carney and Mr. Poilievre are running in seats in Ottawa, or suburban Ottawa, one seat right next to the other. So one is running, Carney is running in Nepean, which is a kind of a Western Ottawa suburb. And Poilievre is running in Carleton, which is a kind of a southwestern Ottawa suburb. So their ridings are next door to each other, and they probably will both be elected. So it just means, of course, that Ottawa will be well represented in the House of Commons, and that may be a bit, we'll call it, alienating to people who live in other parts of the country, specifically Western Canada or Quebec. Justin Trudeau, you might remember, he ran in the Papineau riding in Montreal, which is located kind of in the Park X neighborhood. That's sort of that area, and he always won by a huge amount. So it remains to be seen what will happen in that riding this time, but chances are the Liberals will win that one again. One of the big questions that has to be answered or should be addressed is that what should Canada's response to Trump, what should it be? Should it be a kind of a hard response, a defiant response, a tit for tat response, or should it be a kind of a buttering up, soft response, complimenting Trump, giving him victories that don't matter too much? Those are two methods that have been tried so far by different politicians or different leaders in different countries, and we really don't know which of these works the best. But certainly it is something that should really be discussed in the election campaign. Yeah, Mr. Poilievre was kind of using the "Make Canada Great Again" type approach, and saying that Trudeau was the cause of all Canada's problems. And of course, once Trudeau disappears, it's almost as if the wind has been knocked out of his sails in that certain sense. The other small factor here is that Trump, of all people, said he'd rather work with a Liberal government than a Conservative government. And, this, of course, has to be taken with a grain of salt in the sense that it may be Trump using reverse psychology to ask Canadians to vote for the Conservatives because he himself prefers the Liberals. I'm sure he doesn't have any preference at all. I'm sure he doesn't know who Mark Carney is or who Poilievre is. And, his hostile opinion of Canada seems to be, from a personal level, seems to be strong, even stronger than his hostility to Mexico, which has a lot more reason to annoy the United States than Canada does. Carney, he from his point of view, has announced a few things like cutting or eliminating the carbon tax, which was one of the main platforms of the Conservative Party. This was a tax which was meant to encourage Canadians to consume less gasoline because the price of gasoline would go up, and thereby causing less CO2 to be emitted into the atmosphere. It's a kind of way of, we'll call it climate policies by taxation. Scientists pretty well know that this does not really work out very well, or in a better way, it's a very inefficient way to get results that you want. First of all, Canadians may just say, look, I don't care about the extra few cents a liter, and I'll just go and buy whatever I want. So that will not achieve the climate policies that they want. It would raise more taxes for the government, that's for sure, which that might be one of their main goals. The extra price on gasoline in and of itself is not enough to make people switch to electric vehicles or to not use a vehicle altogether, because of the nature of our country and how spread apart it is, and how many people not only live in cities but in suburbs where transportation is not as good. So it looked like to most Canadians just another tax grab. And the fact that both Carney and Poilievre want to get rid of it goes along with some of the other decisions that we're seeing in the European Union, which also say, you know what, we made all these policies, we added all these taxes, and we see people are suffering. You might have heard of a scandal, or not a scandal, but an issue in Germany where they wanted to get rid of all of gas stoves because they emit, little tiny bits of, carbon dioxide. And people love gas stoves. People are used to them. People have always had them, and it really caused quite a big stir to say, look, how much difference to the global climate would taking out a few million gas stoves make? And it's really, the honest answer is really next to nothing. I think that if we look as a whole at how to eliminate the carbon dioxide, the generation of power is really the easiest way to change things, because so much carbon dioxide is emitted by electricity plants burning coal or burning natural gas. They're all in one place. They all could be switched over to, from a coal source to a natural gas source, or by building more solar panels, and by expanding nuclear power, by exploiting hydroelectricity. There's a lot of different ways that the power generation can be done, and people are looking into all the changes, as we speak. But to try to tax individual motorists to use less carbon monoxide, to emit less carbon dioxide, to use less gasoline, is a pretty inefficient way of getting to the very important goal of reducing the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And as I've said before, and I've explained before, some of the new approaches are trying to industrialize the removal of carbon dioxide directly from the atmosphere. So, in other words, don't prevent it from going in there, try to get it out once it's there. And there have been a few small pilot programs, but nothing enormous at this point. But I could predict that in the next 5 years, they will come up with some large-scale way to achieve that, that particular goal. To go back to the last poll that I saw in the Canadian election, believe it or not, the Liberals have a 75% chance of winning the most seats. And they are ahead of the Conservatives in the Maritimes, in Quebec, and in Ontario. The Conservatives are ahead in Saskatchewan, Alberta, and British Columbia. And believe it or not, in Manitoba, the two parties are tied. So that really points way, a very negative result at this point for the Conservatives. We should also remember that in politics, whenever a party changes leadership, there's always this big sort of, not big, but there's somewhat of a jump of support because it's a new face, and often that jump doesn't last. So don't be surprised if 2 weeks from now, another poll will show the Conservatives ahead, because, that's the nature of how politics are. If people are frightened and fed up and tired of a government that's been in office for almost for 10 plus years, then they will make their way back to the Conservative Party. But the NDP is way down. The NDP is so far down that they might lose their official status, which you have to get 12 seats to obtain. And they have 24 seats, and it's very possible they can go down to, as low as 6 seats. So what explains that? Is it a shift to the right of the general population, or is it something else? And, when the Conservatives were way ahead in the polls, there was no need for an NDP voter to say, well, maybe I can vote Liberal to keep the Conservatives out of power, because they knew who was going to win the election. But the moment that the results look close or tied, then the NDP voter says, I really don't want the Conservatives in power. I'll just hold my nose and vote for the Liberals in my area, because the NDP doesn't have a chance of winning that particular seat. And so that sort of psychology spreads itself out and can explain the decline of the NDP to their most basic areas of support. What about the Bloc Québécois? Quebec has 78 seats in the House of Commons. And some polls were showing that the Bloc would win more than 50 in the upcoming federal election. The dissatisfaction with the Liberals, of course, was huge. The inability of the Conservatives to make their case before Quebecers is well known. And that leaves the Bloc Québécois. And just as the Parti Québécois, the provincial party, is ahead in the polls, the sentiment toward the Bloc was very high. And excepting for the multi-ethnic seats around Montreal and the few English-speaking seats in the Ottawa area or along the U.S. border, pretty well all the rest of Quebec was set to vote for the Bloc, led by Mr. Blanchet. Trump's, actions have really caused a change even in Quebec. And there are many people who are saying, well, we can't afford to waste our vote. We need a strong voice in Ottawa. The Bloc Québécois, of course, can never win power in Canada because it only runs in Quebec and it's not interested in taking power in Canada. So we're best off voting for the Liberals, who have a chance to win the election, and the Liberals are now ahead of the Bloc Québécois in Quebec. I think, on a popular vote basis. Now, just like the Conservatives in the rest of the country, the Liberals' votes in Quebec are really quite inefficiently used, because we all know that so many of the non-Francophone ridings are so heavily Liberal that these Liberal votes are in a way wasted. So even if the Liberals are ahead in the popular vote, it could be that the Bloc would win more seats. And yet a seat projection that I saw yesterday showed that the Liberals will win more seats than the Bloc if an election was held today. So that means an enormous change in the voting sentiment of the Quebec population. And, it just remains to be seen if that will keep itself going for the rest of the election campaign or not. The Parti Québécois in polling has not gone down as much as the Bloc Québécois has gone down in the federal. And you might ask, well, why is that? How is that possible? They just won a by-election in the Terrebonne riding north of Montreal, the PQ did, unseating a seat that was once held by the CAQ party, by Mr. Legault's party. And the Parti Québécois is marketing itself as the pretty well only alternative to the CAQ, which has now been in power, as you know, for 3 straight elections. And they're ahead in the polls. Now, if you look at how Mr. Trump has affected the Quebec politics, you'll see a difference between the province and in the federal area. because the Parti Québécois vote has gone down a little bit, but not nearly as much as the Bloc Québécois has gone down. Now, Mr. Plamondon, who's the head of the Parti Québécois, he said, well, it's not, just because Trump is threatening Canada, it does not mean that Quebecers don't need independence. And the way he put it, he said, you know, if Quebec separated, then there would be two countries to the north of the United States, two countries to oppose Mr. Trump instead of one country. The logic is not really there because there would be two weaker countries opposing Mr. Trump. And I don't believe that Quebecers are buying that particular kind of explanation because, you know, the proof of the pudding will be in how they vote in the federal election, because that's where the next election is. By the way, we should also know that a provincial election is not due till 2026. So people can say all kinds of things in the meantime, and it doesn't really much matter. Also, the Liberals have not picked a candidate yet who would be the leader of the party in the provincial election. The Parti Québécois might also take note that Trump made English the official language of the United States. I don't know if you heard about this, but he did do that. And needless to say, if he took over Canada, that would apply to Canada as well. And I am positive Mr. Trump couldn't care less about Quebec and would not make any exceptions, which in a certain sense is a bit odd when Canadians were asked, you know, do you support being part of the US? 90% of the Canadians said no, and 10% said yes. Some people might have thought that the 10% were English Quebecers who would think that their language would then be official in the US. But in actual fact, it was Western people who are socially conservative and religious and you know, dyed in the wool kind of independent type thinkers. And they were the ones who were the most supportive of Canada joining the US. In fact, there was a political party set up long before Trump called the Buffalo Party, which was advocating that very step. Now, we're going to go off of that subject for 1 second, and we'll just get into some of the other events of the week. I think circling back now to what's happened in the U.S. this week, there's a few important things have grabbed headlines, and it's so hard to know with this administration, you know, where to focus. But the leaking of confidential military secrets to a reporter is certainly one of the ones that have caught the headlines of the American press. And the Trump administration is trying to poo-poo it and to defame the lawyer who reported it. But needless to say, if the shoe was on the other foot, you know, they would have been up in arms. And it goes to show it's part of the same pattern of amateurism, of not thinking out things carefully, and of using, in a certain way, ideology ahead of practicality to run a government. And it's just part of the same pattern, we would say. The other issue, the other thing of importance to us is the issue of tariffs, which are supposed to be declared on April the 2nd, which means a week from now. And the Trump administration is signaling now that these tariffs may not be applied all at the same time. They may not be all at the same rate. They may not be applied to all the countries. And it's in a certain way a recognition that the American economy itself would suffer more from tariffs put on other countries than than the Trump administration thought. So tariffs are not good for the countries who are subjected to them, but they're also not good for the country imposing them because it just adds higher costs to them directly and indirectly through the inputs that they import, which then have to be transformed and sold in the United States. So it seems as if the message is getting through to Mr. Trump, but sometimes, he just doesn't care. And that's why this explanation of kind of delayed or reduced tariffs is what explains the stock market jumping yesterday. Now let's see what else is here. He the use of his sort of executive powers to override judges, to ignore judgments, to claim immunity, to say that I can do whatever I want. This is the fundamental challenge to the United States and its constitution. Because if that is the case, then there is no check on power. And he believes that he's 100% immune from challenges of any sort. He has already tried to transform the media, the universities, the military, public health, foreign policy, trade, the arts and education. He appointed, someone to head the Kennedy Center for the Arts, somebody from Fox News. One interesting fact that came out, you may or may not have heard about this. You heard about the fact that he wants to withdraw $400 million from Columbia University because of their inadequate response to anti-Semitism, inadequate response to the pro-Palestinian riots that took place there last season. But this number, $400 million, doesn't come out of the blue. Way back when Columbia University was looking to expand its campus, and Columbia University is located in Manhattan in the far north to northwest corner of that borough of New York City. And Mr. Trump had some vacant land that he was desperate to get rid of. And he was asking Columbia $400 million for that land. In the end, Columbia decided not to buy it because they decided to make decisions, to expand in another direction. And Trump never forgot it. So when he decided to punish Columbia for the inadequate response to the pro-Palestinian and anti-Semitic riots that occurred there, the number $400 million didn't come out of the air. He just said, "Okay, you didn't want to give me $400 million then. I'm gonna not give you $400 million now, so that we're even," kind of thing. And that's the way Trump. It's a perfect kind of illustration of how his thinking is. He'll never forget a slight. He'll never forgive an opponent. And I thought that was just such an interesting, juxtaposition of this kind of money. The news media today were full of stories of European universities opening up jobs for fired professors and fired scientists from the US government, because they recognize these people are the top in their field and they don't want these people's knowledge to go to waste. And universities in Holland, universities in France, universities in Belgium have all announced that the governments have announced they're going to spend extra money, to allocate extra money so that these professors can be hired from the Americas, from the US, to expand knowledge and to work on climate issues and work on other things that the American government is now not interested in. The other notable occurrence in that government is again about the Ukraine attitude, and Mr. Vance and Mr. Hesketh, the defense minister, have all now joined the story that, you know, the war was Ukraine's fault, that Ukraine has to give up land, that Russia was never at fault, that Russia only did what's natural. And to say that an aggressor is right against the democracy puts Mr. Trump in the exact same league as Mr. Orban of Hungary and Erdogan of Turkey and Mr. Putin himself. The corruption in the government there has just, you know, is gotten so well known. Trump this week said he wants to have a sponsored Easter egg, an Easter egg celebration in the White House, and he's selling sponsorships. So if you pay him the money, you know, you can get your name written, you know, in the White House, and you can be a sponsor of the Easter egg celebration. What he did last week, forcing law firms to pay for free legal services to the government because he didn't like what they were doing. It's just another way of subverting justice. To ignore the instructions of a judge, to appeal judgments he doesn't like all the way to the Supreme Court, to delay, defend, and deny. You know, that's just the Trump method. He also issued a regulation this week, I'm sure this one you might not have heard about, that it's no longer a crime for U.S. companies to pay bribes to foreign governments to get business. And Mr. Trump said, and he's right, that that's just the way business goes. That's how business is done. You might remember that in Canada, SNC-Lavalin was caught and was fined for paying bribes to Mr. Gaddafi, his relatives in Libya, in order to get a contract. And the government got involved in such a scandal because Mr. Trudeau denied trying to get the SNC-Lavalin off the hook. But it just is a recognition that as far as Mr. Trump is concerned, you know, sort of fairness and morality is not what a part of government should be. Speaking of Turkey, the other really important event, which has hardly got any play here, is that the Prime Minister of Turkey, Mr. Erdogan, arrested his chief political opponent, the mayor of Istanbul, Mr. İmamoğlu, who was set to run against him for the presidency in the elections that I think are going to be held at the end of this year. And very often, the mayorship of Istanbul, the largest country in Turkey, is a stepping stone to becoming prime minister, just as Erdogan was himself a mayor of Istanbul. Now, to arrest somebody, and it's only purely for political reasons, and you know, whatever reason they gave us a fabrication, it means that just the way the United States is moving away from a kind of a standard of democracy, well, Turkey is doing the same thing. And you know, Mr. Trump is just practically inches away, I think, from arresting opponents that he doesn't like for all kinds of various reasons. So the riots have occurred in Turkey now for 6 straight days, people demonstrating against the arrest. It remains to be seen whether this will have any effect whatsoever on Mr. Erdogan. But I think it's a point to show that the behavior of Mr. Trump doesn't only affect what happens in the US, it affects really the mindset of people all around the world who would be supportive of his approach. And it would be a kind of an encouragement for people to go try doing the same things that he's doing. I'm going to talk a little bit. Let me just check my watch. Okay. So another one of Mr. Trump's bugaboos is this idea of freezing migration to the United States, or his idea that illegal migrants are causing untold damage to the country, are committing crimes, and are taking away jobs, and are threatening the country as a whole. And looking at some statistics on migration in the Western Hemisphere, of late, it points out so clearly that the United States is not the only country which has been receiving migrants in America, in the Americas. That the amount of migration now to the U.S. is just about cut off. That the migration from one of the big countries sending migrants out, which is Venezuela, that 85% of Venezuelan migrants live in South America, not in the US. Of course, more than a quarter of the Venezuelan population left the country, close to a third now, because of the deteriorating economic conditions, stolen elections by Mr. Maduro, arrests by Mr. Maduro of anybody opposing him. And really the economic situation, because of that, the boycott on Venezuela, the inability of Venezuela to sell its oil, all of these things have led to dire economic consequences there. And a third of the people left, people who were looking just for a better life or enemies of Mr. Maduro himself. And many countries in South America have welcomed these Venezuelans. I think that at this point their welcome has run out, that people who were in Colombia, the biggest welcoming country, which took almost 3 million Venezuelans, Chile, which is the richest country in South America, took over 1 million Venezuelans. That these people were welcomed at first. These people were given education, were given health care. But after a while, things start to get a bit stale. There always are some incidences of crime which are being perpetrated by these migrants. And, things are slowing down in that whole migration world. But you should also know that the Nicaraguans, also under the dictatorship, have moved to Costa Rica. Haitians, of course, have moved to the Dominican Republic and to Chile. The overall studies show that all of these migrants benefit the countries that they move to in the medium term. Not even in the long term, but even in the medium term, because they provide. Sorry, hold on. Oops. Yeah, my phone just rang. Sorry about that. They provide labor, they earn money, they spend money, and they're young people, so they're not involved in hospitals. Many of them at the beginning have no children, so the state is not responsible for educating them. And the overall picture is a positive one. But like I said, all the South American countries now have sort of toughened up their restrictions on migration. And just because of the numbers of not being able to receive all of these people all at the same time. On the other hand, in the United States, Mr. Trump talks a lot about expelling migrants, but the numbers that he's expelled are not anything extraordinary. The cases that he's done have gotten a lot of publicity, but the actual numbers themselves are not all that different from what was done during the Biden administration. And his explanation that he's sending out only the Venezuelans who are members of gangs, the Tren de Aragua is one of the gangs, but people who have been expelled, when the reporters go talk to them and meet them and meet their families, they say we were never in a gang at all. And some of these young men have tattoos, but a tattoo is not, all members of gangs have tattoos, but not all people who have tattoos are members of gangs. And so these people just get swept up. And what happened was that Mr. Trump sent plane loads of these Venezuelans to El Salvador to be put in jail. And the families who live in Venezuela begged the El Salvador government to let these people go back to Venezuela, which they did, and not to be imprisoned in El Salvador. Mr. Trump has also made a deal with El Salvador to pay $20,000 per prisoner per year to hold these people. So it's a money-making enterprise for El Salvador, and it's a way of getting rid of people that he can't send back to their home countries for Mr. Trump. So he can't send people back to Cuba. He practically can't send people back to Haiti. So, El Salvador is a country that's willing to take, for a price, to take prisoners. It seems their biggest enterprise is building prisons. So that's what he's done. I'm gonna just finish off. Let me check my time here. Hold on. See what else I got here. Let me just see news of the day. Let me talk about the item that just came up yesterday. Going back now, we're gonna go focus back on Israel and its war in Gaza. And of course, we mentioned this last week that Israel restarted the war in Gaza. And the war that they restarted was by attacking who they thought were Hamas operatives. But in a sense, nothing has changed really in over a year. It's been 500 and something days. The Israelis have, I think, managed to actually free a single hostage of all the hostages that were taken, of 250. They killed 3 by accident. And they have not destroyed the political hold of Hamas on the Gaza Strip. So to restart the war was done purely and only for domestic political reasons. And those reasons were that the coalition parties threatened to leave the government if the war wasn't started again. There are still supposedly 24 live hostages left in Gaza. And it seems as if Israel, in a certain way, has decided that the lives of these hostages are not very important. And, it's better for them to pursue the war, to please the right-wing coalition partners who insisted on it, rather than to, try to make a deal to release these hostages. I think Israel learned a lesson in a certain sense from the hostage exchange that they had for Shalit back when they released 1,000 prisoners from Israeli prisons, one of whom was Mr. Sinwar, who became the head of Hamas. And they realized that this kind of ratio of sacrifice was not worth it. And so I think they're in a similar position today. They say, well, we just don't feel it's worthwhile to sacrifice anything to get the hostages back. And that is the feeling, the predominant feeling in the government itself. It's not the feeling in the country as a whole, but it's certainly a feeling in the government itself. What I think is so noticeable, and maybe listeners can try to help me figure this out, is that the person who produced the movie No Other Land, the Arab, it was a joint Arab-Israeli production showing and documenting settler attacks in the West Bank on Arab villages, on really innocent people who were just trying to live where they were living. And this was documented through interviews and through live action filming. So this very person who made the film was attacked yesterday in his village on the West Bank by settlers. He was beaten up, and as usual, the army came in and arrested the Palestinians and arrested this man himself, Mr. Forgot his name for a second, and took him in jail, held him overnight in bad conditions, and finally released him. So the question that I have, of course, this is something that goes on all the time, but why would the government not care that this goes on? That's my question. I mean, here they're spending untold amounts of money and trying to reorganize their public relations department and complaining that Israel gets bad public relations. And yet when an item like this gets shown and gets put on TV, which it always is, and there's always somebody there with a cell phone, this destroys, I would say, millions of dollars of Israeli PR, because how can Israel claim that they're the innocent party in the conflict with the Arabs when these settlers just can go in and not only attack their Arab neighbors, but to do it without any fear of retribution or justice whatsoever. The Minister of Public Security, who just rejoined the government, is Mr. Ben-Gvir, who has been convicted of racism, was refused to serve. His army service was refused because he was a racist, and he's now the head of the police force. And his main instruction was never arrest a settler for attacking a Palestinian. So the question is, again, I come to it and say, doesn't the government know that this kind of behavior causes so much damage to Israel and so much damage to Israeli public relations that they refuse to do anything about it? Because they certainly could if they wanted to. They certainly have all kinds of intelligence. If they have intelligence on what's going on in Arab villages, they certainly have intelligence of what's going on in the Jewish villages. And they have never acted against any of the Jewish terrorists. In fact, the police minister, Mr. Ben-Gvir, said there is no such thing as a Jewish terrorist. And any of them that were held in administrative detention were released because they were under the orders of the public security minister. Kind of, when Israel wonders, well, why is it that in America that the young people overall take the Palestinian side? I mean, just showing these pictures would be enough to convince anybody, and especially a young person, of who is the aggressor and who is the innocent victim. So you have to ask yourself, why does this go on? And the answer kind of divides into two sort of ways to look at it. One way, which is widely held in Israel, is that the whole world is anti-Semitic. The whole world is against the Jews, and whatever the Jewish people do, no matter what it is, they will always be blamed. So if Israel is going to be blamed for anything, then pretty well they can do whatever they want without any extra blame being put on, because they're already guilty from the start. So this is an attitude which has been, I would say, propagated and spread by the Netanyahu government for years and years and years. And it kind of gives them carte blanche to do whatever they want, because they say, well, we're guilty in advance. The UN, will always condemn us. The third world will always condemn us. The usual left-wing professors will always condemn us. And so therefore we could do whatever we want, because we know in advance that we're going to be blamed for everything. So this is a kind of I would call it a sort of a cop-out, but this is the attitude that many people are believe in Israel and are even taught in Israel, that it's Israel against the world, and Israel cannot rely on anybody else but itself. So that's one kind of an explanation. The other one, which I alluded to before, is a bit more down to earth, which is that the settler movement itself, which now comprises somewhere over 500,000 people living in the West Bank. Remember that Israel, except for the city of Jerusalem itself, never formally annexed the West Bank. Technically, it doesn't belong to anybody because it used to belong to Jordan before 1967 when Israel captured it. Jordan relinquished its claim on the West Bank. Therefore, the West Bank is occupied by Israel, but it's not part of Israel. Now, Israel doesn't want to make it part of Israel because it would mean giving the Arab people who live there, the 2.5 million, giving them the right to vote. What they would like to do is take over the territory, but sort of get rid of the Arabs who are living there. And, you know, there's talk about that in Gaza. Israel has just opened a ministry office to ease the emigration of Gaza people who want to go out of the country voluntarily, quote unquote, voluntarily. So the aim of the settlers is to, in any way possible, to tell the Palestinian people that they don't belong there, that they should leave. And if worst comes to worst, not leave the West Bank itself, but at least get out of the areas that the Jews want to settle in and let them go live in the cities that the Palestinians are controlling. So this kind of more practical approach, you could call it a sort of an ethnic cleansing approach, is one which is certainly popular with the right wing in Israel. They've just announced that illegal settlements have been made legal, 16 of them. Today there was an announcement in the news. And the whole point of this settlement is to prevent the emergence of a Palestinian state, because if the settlers are living all over the West Bank, then how could Palestine possibly exist with all these people living there? Of course, there is an answer to that. The answer is simply that these people, upon the creation of a Palestinian state, would have a choice to either leave or to stay, just the way the Arab people did when Israel was created in 1948. But this is so far from the reality of today. It's so far from the aspirations of the settlers that they would consider it a joke if someone even brought it up. But practically speaking, they have succeeded. They have established settlements not only on what used to be the border between Israel and Jordan, but deep inside the territory of the West Bank, both on the southern side, which is called Judea by them, and on the northern side, which is called Samaria by them, and done in such a way that there's a kind of a checkerboard of settlements which are not close to each other, so that they occupy the maximum amount of territory, leaving the sort of Palestinian cities more or less disconnected from each other in a certain way. And the government has just continued to pour money into these settlements and into roads serving the settlers and into security measures protecting the settlers. And the needs of the Palestinian people have not been, there is really no way to address these needs by the Israeli government, because what they say is that it's the Palestinian administration, the Palestinian Authority, who's responsible for the majority of the Palestinians living in those territories, and it's not up to Israel to deal with those people, and that is correct for those Palestinians living in cities which are considered to be part of Area A, which is an area of the Palestinian cities themselves, like Nablus or Ramallah or Bethlehem or Tulkarm or Jenin. But Israel still has the security control over these places, so they're able to go in whenever they want to root out terrorists and to take actions like that. So that is why Mr. Netanyahu is in absolutely no pressure, or he is in no mood to sort of come to some sort of resolution about this, because he has the best of both worlds. He controls all the territories from a security point of view, but the people living in those territories have no claim on Israel, no right to vote in Israeli elections. They receive no money from Israel, practically speaking. And they, are practically, they, like I said, it's the best of both worlds. He controls them, but is not responsible for them. He controls them, but doesn't pay anything, for their well-being. And he never has to make a case to the UN as to why Israel has annexed these territories, which they have not annexed. So, but the settlers' attacks. I mean, on all people, someone who just won an Oscar in the United States for a film that describes the exact same thing that just happened. It just seems so ironic. And I have the feeling that Israel has no idea how badly this type of actions are received in the rest of the world. So just finishing with that. Yeah, I think my time is about finished, and I've covered many different. Sometimes I just cover one or two subjects at a whole time, but this time so many different things in the news sort of caught my eye, and I thought it might be worthwhile to mention them. So if you've got some ideas, questions, comments, I'm sure some of you don't agree with the approach anyway that I've explained, but to me it seems logical. So let me know. And Angela is there to take your questions and comments, and we'll see where it goes.
I just wanted to mention to everyone listening in that Mr. Dwoskin will be back on April 8th in person in the auditorium.
That's right, April 8th.
And
Not too long from now.
And he will not only be in person, but if you can't actually physically come to the auditorium, we will still be on Zoom and the TBS line. So you'll still be able to see him, but we'd always prefer you to come in person.
Right. And not only that, but April 7th, I'm coming back to Montreal. So the first thing I have to do is to come to Cote-Saint-Luc, London Public Library, and come give a class. So it goes to show, I think, how really important you are all to me, because I just enjoy so much speaking to you and seeing you in person, especially. So please do come on April the 8th and all the subsequent Aprils on Tuesdays, so that I could meet you all in person.
I would just like to mention that it's at 2 p.m. in the auditorium.
Right, 2 p.m. But the auditorium downstairs, not the big, beautiful, city hall. What do they call it? The city
Council chamber.
The city council chamber where I used to be able to speak. That was a better venue in a way.
So there is a comment here by an anonymous attendee. It says, any comments on the new rules concerning Canadians entering the U.S.?
Yeah, there are new rules in a way, and it's all part of this whole. President Trump has an idea, not only to make America great again, but to say that America is alone in the world. And in a certain way, it mirrors Mr. Netanyahu's approach as well. So it's not that America has allies and they all work together to make a better future for everyone, but that it's America alone against the world, and the whole world is against America. And so the way to protect America is to build a wall, literally sometimes, and spiritually other times, to build a wall around America so that bad people can't get in. And the first thing he tried to do was to say that any Canadian who wants to spend more than 30 days in the US must be fingerprinted, as if there's some sort of a criminal coming into the US. the outcry was so great among the tourist operators in Florida, which is the most visited state where I am, and other states like New York or California, which are the other big visited states, Arizona as well, that he dropped that requirement. And it goes to show again how the amount of planning and forethought is so small, because to change your mind, on something that you proclaim, it sort of shows what a bad planner you are. But there is a requirement that people who spend more than 30 days in the US from any country in the world have to register with the US authorities. And, it's a sort of a piece of security which, is certainly done by many countries. Have this information these days, especially now with electronics and visas and things like that. All this information is recorded anyway. If you, as a Canadian, have a Nexus card, which I highly recommend getting, then you don't have to go through with these registration procedures. So, that's what's happening over there. Canada, on the other hand, has re-emphasized and has started to look at people returning from the U.S. who have been in the U.S. only for a day, which often people used to do a little shopping and come back into Canada for the day. They say they're cracking down on that policy, and that they are going to charge duty on anything you bring back if you haven't been in the States for more than 24 hours. So there were cases like that publicized as well. And it just goes to show how, there's practical consequences for actions which are, sometimes, political actions have immediate and economic consequences. That's the point that I wanted to make. So America is getting strict on people overstaying their visas, which is really, when they talk about illegal migrants, so many of them are not people who have come into the US illegally, but who have come into the US legally and didn't leave when they were supposed to. And many of those people are Canadians who work in the States somehow, or who just live in the States and they don't really remember or care when they're supposed to go back. And, so these people are no threat, no security threat to the United States, but, they fall into this illegal immigrant category, of which there are now in the US an estimated 11 to 14 million people. I also should remind you, no, not remind, but to state again, that the US government once had a policy that people coming from dangerous countries where there was either a natural disaster or an economic disaster or a political disaster. So countries like Cuba, countries like Haiti, countries like Nicaragua and Venezuela, that these people would have temporary asylum in the US. And there's over 500,000 people in that category, and Trump has now removed all those temporary protections from those people. So technically speaking, those people are in the US now illegally, and they could be removed at any time. Anyone, any other ideas?
No, not yet. But I wanted to ask you about if you heard anything about the protests that are happening in Turkey.
Yes, I did mention it briefly. The protests are now 6 days going. People are outraged by the blatant political arrest of the leader of the opposition. It's as if, imagine if Mr. Poilievre was very, very popular, a popular mayor, decided to run against the Liberal government, and then he gets arrested on very, very trumped up charges. I use the word Trump, kind of purposefully. Charges which would never stand up. And Turkey is still a democracy. They still do have elections. There still is a very strong opposition. one very strong opposition party, and then several other small parties in the country. The country is divided in a way between a kind of a rural, more religious, more conservative, less well-off population, and the urban population in the big cities who are more attuned to the Western world, who are more liberal, who are less outwardly religious. And that division is quite a strong one in Turkey. And if you add on the Kurdish population, which has been suppressed, although they are also a rural population, but being Kurds, they're not being given the feeling that they belong in the country. So they're also part of the opposition. Their opposition leader was arrested a while back, and their party that represented them was dissolved. So Mr. Erdogan uses all kinds of political tricks to kind of skew the deck to make him win. But you know, the last time when he tried that in the Istanbul elections, the election results were that the man who they arrested won by a very small margin, like under 1%. And so what Mr. Erdogan did, and he was the president of the country, he said, I'm annulling the elections and I'm calling for new elections because of, you know, some kind of ridiculous excuse. And in the new elections, the same guy, Mr. Imamoglu, he won by a much greater margin than he won the first time. So this was a kind of a lesson to Erdogan not to meddle or to try to blatantly skew the election results. And you know, now he's just so afraid of losing that he's taken the gamble of trying to arresting this man who's the mayor of Istanbul, popularly elected. And all it does is you sort of get the opposition united against him and stir up the people, you know, with no kind of end in sight. So it's actually, you know, if someone, and I love Turkey, I've been there 4 times. I think it's an amazing country to visit. It's got so much to offer. But, you know, if you're politically involved in any which way, if you intend to do any political actions in the country, it's not a good idea. By the way, Istanbul Airport is one of the busiest airports in the world, one of the top 10 busiest airports in the world. In fact, I think top 7 busiest airports in the world. Anyone else? So we don't know what's going to happen with this whole affair, but people are certainly outraged that, you know, you could pick somebody, a popular elected person, and just arrest them because you are afraid of them and you don't like them. You know, this is a mark of a dictatorship, not a democracy. And if you listen to Mr. Trump's words that all his opponents are traitors, that the news media who are against him are enemies of the state, this is certainly, you know, halfway to becoming an undemocratic country.
I don't see anything yet, Mr. Dwoskin.
Okay, we'll wait a little bit. We'll wait a little bit, and you know, I think people who are, especially people who are in business, are very, very insecure now because they have to do major decisions every single day, but not knowing what the rules of the game are, and that the rules of the game change from one week to another. This is creating a huge amount of instability, and the stock market is, you know, a reflection of that. You heard about Tesla, all the attacks on Tesla, people wanting to give in their Teslas, people vandalizing Teslas on the street, people vandalizing Tesla dealerships, as was done in Montreal. All this is a kind of a retribution for Mr. Musk's participation in the government, for Mr. Musk's participation in firing hundreds of thousands of American employees of the federal government with the aim to try to make America more efficient. But really, it's to try to get rid of certainly opponents of Mr. Trump, to get rid of areas of the government which tend not to support Mr. Trump, And his role in that, and his role as the head of Tesla, means that he's just such an easy target, or Tesla is such an easy target for people who oppose the government in the US. And Tesla's sales have dropped tremendously over the last, since Mr. Trump got elected. The Chinese car company BYD has now officially sold more cars. It is the top electric car company in the world, with more sales than Tesla is. And people just don't know what to do with their Teslas. And insurance companies are also saying, well, if people are attacking the cars, what we have to do is make insurance on Teslas more expensive than insurance on other electric cars. So you could see how, like I said before, political notions have practical economic consequences. That's another good example of it.
So I see someone has raised their hand. Janice, if you could unmute your microphone and ask your question to Mr. Dwoskin, please.
And I see Janice. I see Janice's iPad there.
Okay. Yes, you don't think that what's happening in the West Bank is being deliberately caused to keep Netanyahu in power?
No. The question was, let me make sure everyone has heard it, that what's happening in the West Bank is being done to keep Mr. Netanyahu in power. I don't get the logic. Maybe you could explain how you put one and one together to get two. How would what's happening in the West Bank act to keep Mr. Netanyahu in power? Do you think?
Well,
yeah, go ahead.
Well, they would vote. The settlers there would vote for him, and there's a lot of them.
Well, for sure, that's true. The settlers who live in the West Bank do vote for Mr. Netanyahu's party, the Likud party, but they also vote very strongly for the two parties which form his coalition, which is the Jewish Power Party, Otzma Yehudit, it's called in Hebrew, and for the Religious Zionism Party, led by Mr. Smotrich, who is another ultra-right-wing member of Mr. Netanyahu's party. So I would say that the settler vote is by and large divided into three parts. All three parts are in the government at present. So there's no real support for any of the other political parties in Israel, which there are 33 ran in the last election. Those three parties capture more than 90% of the settlers' votes. But the polls are showing now that if an election were held today, Mr. Netanyahu and his coalition partners would receive, they now have 64 seats out of 120. They would receive about 54 out of 120. So it means that they would lose power because of the way mostly because the Israeli population is so critical of Mr. Netanyahu and the way he responded to the Gaza, allowing the Gaza attacks to happen in the first place, and his response to them in the second place. So, those would be the prime movers of Israeli politics. I should mention that Mr. Bennett, Naftali Bennett, who was the former prime minister, has been very active now in Israel in expressing his opinions. He came to Montreal, and I met him or saw him at a speech he gave last fall, and he looked like he looked like a candidate for the leader of the country. He spoke like a politician. He spoke in a way that would try to appeal to the most possible people, and that is actually how he ran his government when he was in power. But he was undermined by Mr. Netanyahu's brilliant opposition and the bribing of some of Mr. Bennett's own members of his own party to switch parties. And so his government lost the majority, and an election was held which Mr. Netanyahu won. if things keep on going the way they're going, Mr. Netanyahu yesterday just avoided another election by passing a budget. And as I said last time, the budget had to have been passed by the end of March. Otherwise, elections would have automatically been called. And there were threats by the ultra-Orthodox not to support the budget unless exemptions were given to ultra-Orthodox students to go into the army. And as I had said last time, I predicted correctly that the ultra-Orthodox would fold and they would support the budget simply because they're much better off in the government than out of the government. And Mr. Ben Gvir, the racist who head of the Jewish Power Party, he quit the government because he thought that the government was not aggressive enough toward the Palestinians. And he's a party who wants the government to keep all of Gaza. He's a party that wants the government to keep all of Gaza and to resettle Jewish settlers back there in Gaza, kind of as a punishment for the attacks on October 7th. And because the settlers were there from 1967 to 2005, and he felt they never should have left, and so he wants them to come back. He voluntarily left the government, but we all knew this was just a political tactic, and that he would come back, and he did come back once Israel started attacking Gaza again. So the government is back to where it was before, and they're now in a stable situation where they can hold office until the next elections are due.
So we have another question by an anonymous attendee. It says, will the U.S. recover from Trump in 2028?
What a question. Wow. It's so, it's so hard to think about the U.S. recovering from Trump in 2025, that 2028 seems so far off. I think that the political horizon in the U.S. is not 2028, but 2026. And November 2026 is when the next elections are held in the U.S., not for president, but for the Senate and the House of Representatives. So you all know that every 2 years, the entire House of Representatives is up for election, and 1/3 of the Senate is up for election. Right now in the Senate, the Republicans have control by 53 to 47, and in the House of Representatives, they have control by about 217 to 212. So obviously 217 to 212 is practically tied. And if the Democrats succeed in 2026 to retake the majority in the House of Representatives, then there will not be any chance for Mr. Trump to pass any kind of legislative bills that would be, not well received by the American public. But Mr. Trump seems to have sort of foregone the whole legislative process altogether and just issues what he calls presidential decrees and says, I'm so powerful that I could do whatever I want, and I don't even need the legislature to back me up. So this is a whole new take on American government, where the president has all the power and the legislature has no power. So, that's the way he's going to be ruling from now on until perhaps 2028. I would like to just say that in general, we know that in politics, just like in physics, for every action, there is an opposite reaction. And the American public are being treated to the most right-wing, most erratic, the most populistic, the most dictatorial style of government that they've ever seen. So if this bothers them, they will react in 2026 and elect the Democrats in a majority. And Mr. Trump is only allowed to serve 2 terms, so he will definitely not be around as a candidate in 2028. Will America be able to survive? Of course they will, but in a changed way. The question is, in a way, if the Democrats do take power in 4 years' time, can they undo all the damage that he's done, in the first 2 months? And that's really a question that's hard to answer.
Well, there's also a comment saying, thank you for your wonderful lectures. Have a safe trip home and see you in Cote-Saint-Luc.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. I'll see you all in Cote-Saint-Luc. But please tune in next week because I'll still be here. So thanks
No,
again.
you're not going to be online next week.
Oh, I'm not? What
No,
is next week? April the
first.
April the 1st. Oh,
Yes.
so there isn't a class till April the 8th. Is that
Yes.
it?
Yes.
Okay. I'm glad you reminded me. So we'll see you all on April the 8th in that case.
Thank you, everyone, to listening in, and thank you to Mr. Dwoskin. Have a
Okay.
great rest of your day.
Okay, bye. Oh, I'm not on.